Good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar, ERM Implementation, a primer to a five-step process. My name is Jeff Rigsby, and I'm the President and CEO of CB Resource, and I will be presenting today's session. First, I would like to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. In our invitation, we indicated the session will run about 30 minutes, and we're certainly committed to keeping to that schedule. For those of you who aren't familiar with CB Resource, we are based in Irvine, California. And just to let you know, our primary purpose is to support our clients' ability and effort to synchronizing their performance and risk management priorities. And we do that primarily through our enterprise risk management, strategic and capital planning solutions. So let's go ahead and just before we get started, just wanted you to get the most out of the webinar. So for those of you that have any questions as we go through the process, please feel free. You can use the instant messaging capability. We will have a brief Q&A at the end. Also, for those of you who might like a copy of the presentation, by all means, either shoot us an email, give us a call, or send us a message through GoToWebinar, and we'll certainly get that sent out to you as well. So the purpose of today's webinar is really I'd like you to focus on two things with me. Number one, I definitely want to define the five-step process of implementing an effective ERM program, and we'll do that. And number two, let's focus on operationalizing this process and having that process provide actionable intelligence. Because if you think about it from an enterprise risk management standpoint, one of the primary benefits is creating these robust outputs to support management's ability to make better decisions, whether it relates to performance or risk management. Lord knows we can easily spend an entire webinar on either of these areas. And should you have any additional questions beyond what we covered today, we certainly invite you to give us a call and set up or schedule a session. So with that, so what we'll cover, a brief definition of what ERM is, why ERM. We'll talk about a model, and then we'll spend the balance of our time as far as how to implement the process. And then we'll have some closing thoughts and a little Q&A at the end. You know, and it is worth noting, as a community bank, the level of effort and complexity in many cases is driven by the size of your bank or the focus or your business model. And it's worth noting that ERM is not necessarily one size fits all. So, you know, as far as what is ERM, oh my goodness. My apologies. Should have turned my phone off. So what is ERM? Enterprise risk management is a formal process that was initially developed by the COSO committee, or COSO, which stands for the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission. And back in 2004, they developed this framework, which really outlined a process to assess and look at enterprise risk management for any type of organization. They subsequently came back in 2017 and further defined enterprise risk management as includes the culture, capabilities, and practices integrated with strategy setting and performance that organizations rely on to manage risk in creating, preserving, and realizing value. So what's really important, and the key takeaways that I believe is important about enterprise risk management, number one, it is a process. So yes, there's software and there's other elements that support your ability to implement an ERM program. It's important to understand it's a process. We think it's strategic driven, so therefore it tends to be top down, and we'll talk about that in a second. It does outline that your risk appetite sets the framework that ties back to your strategy. And if you use it well, it will support your ability to not only achieve your goals, but to drive optimum value. So with that in mind, let's take a look at top-down versus bottoms-up. So when we talk about ERM, we'll be discussing it from a top-down approach today. We think by definition, ERM is designed to tie into your strategic priorities and your performance priorities. But it's also important to understand that there is a bottoms-up approach. Bottoms-up approach tend to be kind of tied back to GRC systems or government regulatory compliance systems. They're more granular in nature, and they certainly get into process testing and control testing. But from a top-down perspective, it is about risk analysis tied to earnings, capital, and franchise value. It does tend to focus on major decisions that are supported by these key risk insights. It tends to focus on top risk as you go through the enterprise risk assessment process, so that you're addressing those things that could potentially threaten or inhibit optimal performance. And it does provide effective oversight for bank-wide risk management, and it does facilitate the process between senior management and the board to have more robust risk-based dialogues. Bottoms up is certainly a more robust system to get granular, to get to the point of the spear, if you will, and support bottoms up or frontline inputs. So those are kind of the two. For the purposes of today's session, we will be focusing on a top-down approach. And when you think about that, it is the primary purpose of ERM is to assist your bank in maximizing your earnings, capital, and franchise value. To be honest, regulatory compliance is a byproduct and not necessarily a key driver. As a matter of fact, I would argue that if an ERM system doesn't support regulatory guidelines or process, it's probably not worth implementing. From a philosophical perspective, we believe that a forward-thinking top-down approach serves the purpose well. It's fair to say that most of you, and as far as community banks go, risk management is what you do. So you are kind of doing enterprise risk management. However, the need to adopt an integrated approach that is both well-designed and efficient is certainly the next wave in bank management. Clearly, the regulatory climate is shifting in real time towards expecting community banks to have a robust risk management system that captures and documents not only the decisions you make, but how those decisions are formed. So if you think about it, your ERM system should really do the following. It should support your ability to make strategic driven or to support the achievement of your strategic objectives. It should enhance your overall institutional decision making. It should elevate the level of risk awareness. Back in the day, we used to be credit risk aware. Now it's overall, enterprise risk aware across the enterprise. If it's working, it should reduce your operational surprises or losses. It should better prepare the organization to take risk associated with your risk appetite. If well implemented, it should create better or more effective business continuity. And ultimately, it should break down those functional silos and help more cross-functional communication. One thing I do want to stress is ERM is not about risk avoidance. It really is about right-sizing your capabilities and controls to meet the demands of your risk appetite. So taking on additional risk or having a higher risk appetite to achieve where you want to go, be it growth, optimal earnings, things of that nature, is not a bad thing. It's do I have the appropriate controls in place in order to develop that sustainable growth, sustainable earnings? That's what ERM is all about. And remember, some people say it's also about in the best of times you're getting more than your fair share, and in the worst of times you're probably pulling your chips off the table a little sooner than others. So let's spend the balance of our time as far as talking about these 5 steps of implementation. As far as we hope this will provide a useful output and review of each step. Additionally, each of the slides you'll see in the subsequent definitions will provide highlights, and it'll really drill down to the key takeaways of each of the following steps. Now, if you were to look at ERM as a flow chart or a model, right? And we talked about its purpose of supporting optimal earnings and franchise value. There's 5 steps, right, in a top-down approach. So we talk about, all ERM systems should effectively identify, measure, monitor, and control risk. That's what ERM is all about, right? A top-down version bolts on something on the front end, and that we would discuss from a perspective of governance, right? It asks the question of what's your strategic intent? What's your capital adequacy? And ultimately define your risk appetite, which is what are you willing to do or not do to make money, to grow and create value in your enterprise. So when you think about it from a flowchart standpoint, implement governance, and we'll talk about that a little further. When you think about identifying risk, that's really all about your enterprise risk assessment process, right? So it's defining the inherent risk, adequacy of risk management, residual and direction of risk by however you frame your risk categories. For the purposes of this discussion, we'll talk about risk categories from a perspective of credit risk, interest rate risk, liquidity risk, price, operational, compliance, strategic, and reputation. But it could also be mortgage risk. It could be trust. It could be insurance. It could be payment systems, and it could be the products and solutions that fall within each of those key risk categories. But that's your risk identification system. When we talk about measuring risk, we're talking about further analysis as to what your top risks are, in analyzing what those risks are, prioritizing those risks, and looking at the likelihood of them occurring, how severe the impact would be if they were to occur, and assessing that risk to such a point that if there is residual risk, it can populate a risk mitigation plan. Monitoring is just answering the question of who gets what and when to form better decisions, and control is about that, right? It's about forming good decisions based on good information as an ongoing process. And if you think about ERM, think of it in terms of being a continuous loop and a continuous improvement loop. Just a quick mention on project management. The nature of implementing ERM could be subject to project creep if you're not careful. So just if you think about it in terms of timeline, just take a look at them from a modular perspective, right? So when you think of governance, think of it as outputs, right? What am I going to do under governance? I'm going to assemble my team. I'm going to define my framework. I'm going to integrate strategy and capital to help me develop my risk appetite. And I'm going to set up my policies and charter. You know, phase 2, I'm going to develop my assessments, right? I'm going to conduct assessments, both using qualitative and quantitative analysis, external and internal, to drive to a risk profile. The next step is to identify those top risks that potentially threaten my ability to optimize my performance and make sure I've got appropriate mitigants in place, right? And then ultimately I set up my dashboard, my monitoring system, and I develop a system that can continually measure, track, and report how my risks are moving so I can make best, risk-based decisions on an ongoing basis. But again, a project plan is kind of critical when you jump into implementing ERM. So let's go ahead and start with step 1, which would be governance, or aligning, which should align with your strategic intent. A top-down ERM approach does start here, and the key aspects of governance is to understand your strategic course of action, the capital necessary to do that, and what your risk appetite or tolerance of risk is, right? So let's think about this a little bit. So if you're looking at it from a risk category standpoint, we tend to use a heat map, and we do it by risk category. And the question is what am I willing to do or not do to make money? So let's talk about credit risk for example. Key factors to consider as to how much risk you're willing to take would include how much growth. Are you growing a modest level, a moderate level, an aggressive level? Are you doing acquisitions? Who do you serve and how do you serve them? So what are your project selections? What are your yields and costs? What are your credit quality decisions? Each one of those primary components drive a decision, if you will, to what you're willing to do or not do by that risk category. And so what you want to do is follow a step-by-step process to answer the questions associated with the level of risk you're willing to take, whether it's credit risk, interest rate risk, liquidity risk, thinking about operational risk today, which involves a lot of IT. So if you're looking at online banking, if you're looking at multiple branching, if you're looking at mergers and acquisitions, how does that influence your risk appetite? The more you want to do any one of those things, certainly elevates the level of risk you're willing to take, and it's then the challenge of a good ERM system to ensure the controls are in place to address that. So if you think about risk appetite, you want to answer the questions of what am I willing to do or not do in these key risk categories. You want to then take the next step of developing risk appetite statements that further define what that risk is, or what those steps are you're willing to take in terms of your risk appetite. And then thirdly, you want to develop key risk indicators. So if you see an example here, it's looking at whether it's credit risk, interest rate risk, all those key risk categories. What are my key risk indicators or key performance indicators? So you list them out, and then answer the question, what does low to high risk look like in each one of those conditions? And once you've got that framework established, it allows you to track forward and backward, or however you want to determine it, as to where do I fall within my risk ranges, right? So if you're thinking of credit risk and you're looking at things like growth, or you're looking at things like classified to capital, what's acceptable and what starts pushing up my risk range from a KRI standpoint. So the 3 takeaways, from a risk appetite standpoint is the heat map, the statements and the KRIs. And also within governance, you want to take and address both policy and charter, right? So policies dictate how you're going to manage a process. The charter indicates what the committee's roles and responsibilities are in supporting your enterprise risk management process. Now, as far as if your risk appetite is your desired state, which you could argue that's what it is, then your risk assessment process, which is step 2 in this 5-step process, is your actual state, right? We've divided this phase of the discussion into 2 components. So we'll talk about framework first, and then we'll talk about implementing the process. So prior to conducting your assessment, it's kind of useful to adopt a framework that captures your analysis. If you're an OCC bank or an FRB bank, they're kind of providing you with the framework, right? OCC actually provides it to you in their safety and soundness exam. But it's really important before you get started to adopt a framework. And so, for example, if you're an OCC bank, you might adopt their 8 key parts or components of risk. FRB's got its own dashboard, if you will, or you could use CAMELS, which is another acceptable framework. The important thing that I want to stress at this front end is adopt a framework that is executable from your perspective, and if it happens to align with regulatory communication, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But and for those of you that are OCC banks versus non-OCC banks, OCC's version of inherent risk is quantity of risk. Their version of adequacy of risk management is quality of risk management. But it's more or less nomenclature, right? So the first thing I want to stress is just make sure that you adopt a framework that's logical and communicates well across the organization. Once you've adopted your framework, really the next step is to aggregate the necessary data before you start your risk assessment process. And I know you can't read this, but over here to the left, and if you guys would like a copy of this, just let me know. But this basically outlines the key criteria or data points that are useful when conducting an enterprise risk assessment. So if you're using key risk categories as your framework, so credit risk, interest rate risk, liquidity risk, what is it I need to test or assess, if you will, in order to get a good sense of my enterprise risk levels, right? So credit risk probably has the most things, and it could be anything from answering a series of assessment statements that deal with inherent risk and adequacy of risk management, to reviewing any stress testing you're doing, to looking at your ALLL levels, to looking at your policies, to looking at your product mix, at least a 3-year forecast, right? Because ERM is all about forward looking. But you definitely want to establish your criteria in order to understand what is it you're going to measure by risk category, key element of the risk assessment process. Once you've got that in place, I would suggest that you rely on your risk owners to drive your risk assessments by risk category. So whether it's credit risk, interest rate risk, compliance risk, operational risk, strategic risk, reputation risk. I mean, when I think about it, credit's usually owned by the CCO. Interest rate risk and liquidity risk would be the chief financial officer. Operational risk would be kind of your COO or your SVP of ops. There's an IT component in that. Strategic risk and reputation risk, I certainly like to see the chief executive involved. But the primary point I want to make here is in order to effectively assess by risk category, you need to have ownership, you need to have a framework and a process, and then methodically go through that. And I just want to show you one quick example, and I'll use credit. So we happen to have something called a control document, which is nothing more than an audit trail. So even if you're using a web-based assessment approach to conducting your assessments, this is a proposed structure, if you will, by creating modules by risk category. So let's just use credit risk as an example. So the first thing you do is define what the risk is. Develop and summarize what your risk profile is. So define why your inherent risk is X and why your adequacy of risk management is Y, what the composite or residual risk is, and what the direction is. And be able to support that by summary of findings, right? So when you look at your control systems and you've gone through the assessment itself, summarize what those key controls are that represent favorable aspects of your risk management associated with credit risk. Now, here's the important part of the risk assessment process. The next thing you really want to discuss is the unfavorable conditions or emerging risk or threats as it relates to the risk category and capture them. This is kind of the key benefit to ERM, right? It's answering the question is what's likely to occur. Now, you may use additional information like psychodemographic analysis, key market trend analysis, economic data, things of that nature. But in all those factors, you want to summarize what's on the horizon and then complete your assessment. This is an example of a series of statements that respond to inherent risk, adequacy of risk management, so it's all there. But it doesn't stop with just the assessment questions. If that's all your assessment's doing, you're not really answering the question of what's your growth forecast look like? What's your asset quality trends look like? What's your composition trends look like? What do your concentrations look like? And summarize them. Are there any key variances that you're tracking and looking at your key risk indicators? So what I just wanted to share with you in this quick example is each of your modules for your risk categories, whether it's web-based, automated technology, whatever you're using, define your risk, have a key risk profile or your risk profile by risk category, a summary of findings, and then your detail, right? That provides a good audit trail and an effective way to conduct an enterprise risk assessment. The next piece really just gets into what we call measurement, right? Which is prioritizing and identifying your top risk. And this is kind of visual. I know you can't quite see this. And this isn't necessarily embedded in any risk assessment. This is the challenge of, say, the CRO or whoever is the surrogate for supporting your enterprise risk management process. But what you want to do very simply is say, are there certain conditions or potential risks that we need to further evaluate? If you're an acquirer, if you are heavily involved in mergers and acquisitions and you're working on a target, that could be considered a top risk if you're in the midst of an acquisition. If you are expanding your online banking capabilities and you're moving more and more through alternative delivery channels to market and deliver your products and services, that could be a top risk. If you're entering new markets, if you're running 110% loan to deposit ratio and liquidity comes into question, whatever those top risks are, you want to capture them. And then ask yourself the question, what's the likelihood and severity of that risk occurring? Where does that risk reside? And that's what this piece of the assessment does. And then what do my controls look like? How do I rate my controls? If there is residual risk in this process, then nominate mitigating actions, take those nominated actions into a risk mitigation plan. And this to me is where this is the money shot for a top-down risk assessment process as it relates to ERM. Identifying those top risks and having a formal discipline that quantifies if those risks are under control. If you go through this process and everything's good, residual risk is low, then question asked and answered. If it's high, then what are we going to do about it to further control those risks? And these risks have been identified as top risks, correct? Okay. So now the next piece we really move into is just setting up how we monitor and track our risk, right? It's the monitoring system. Who gets what and when? So the question is to determine what's the frequency of the reports we're going to look like? What's the construct, right? What do we want to look at? How do we want to look at it? This should be committee driven. And again, I would set up a reporting system that addresses the audience, right? It's whether it's a board member, management, or committee level, and make sure everybody's seeing what they need to see. And then ultimately, you should also be including identifying emerging risk or threats along with your assessment results, and then tracking movement over time, right? And that is kind of the money shot for a good internal control system or a good monitoring system. So summary there is who gets what and when, and what's the frequency in which the data is being updated. And when you think about reporting, again, think about your audience. So if you're thinking about the board kind of wants to know, hey, what are our top risks we're dealing with? How's it tie back to performance? Are there any potential or emerging risks we need to be sensitive to? How are we performing against KRIs? And is there any other data we should be aware of, right? So that should be a relatively high-level brief report that keeps the board in the loop, right? The next level of reporting goes to management, which is a little more detailed, a little more specific, and helps them develop good decisions about anticipating or controlling risk. And then lastly, the committee, and you guys own it all, right? So that's the gold trust, if you will. And again, to show you kind of taking a brief departure to show you what an example of one way to do that is, this would be a typical quarterly report that any bank could create. You know, this is what we do, but you can create your own. And it's really designed for senior management and the board. It does summarize the risk appetite, your risk profile. It analyzes capital. And then it establishes a report per risk category, right? So if you think about it, can you structure something that says, okay, based on current data, and this is generated quarterly, what's our risk appetite? What are we willing to do or not do to make money? How do we further define what we're willing to do? What's our risk profile in relationship to our risk appetite? You know, if you're willing to take a lot of risk in a certain area, and you see that your inherent risk is moderate, high, or high, if you've got a higher risk appetite, you really want to make sure your adequacy of risk management is strong, acceptable to strong, right? If it's acceptable or below that, you better be backing off the level of risk you're willing to take, right? So that's kind of the 30,000 foot level. This is something where you could actually analyze how capital is performing against your risk profile, and is your capital levels and buffer levels appropriate? And then just get into your assessment itself, right? So here's a quick summary of what all of the roll-up data might be by risk category. So you can take a look at what's our level of risk that currently exists, how well are we controlling it, and what's the direction of the risk? Is it increasing, decreasing, or stable? And then lastly, I would just comment on, you know, try to create a useful number of KRIs by risk category. So be it credit risk, interest rate risk, liquidity, come up with a simple way to identify those KRIs, reflect trends, reflect variances, and provide good, useful information to management. Okay. So when we started the session, I kind of wanted to stress the process, right? And if we think about our 5 steps, you know, you certainly want to break your ERM process down into modules, right? Into task-oriented steps that move from an implementation phase into an operational phase. And think in terms of inputs and outputs, right? What's the data I need to gather? What does it need to look like when it comes out? And those outputs really should be designed to support sound decision making, right? You want to ensure that your risk management folks are in line with your performance management folks, right? You want a collective team. But in the end, when you think about the 5 steps we discussed, you want to come away with that first step. If you're thinking in terms of outputs, you should have committee structure, roles and responsibilities, a clearly defined risk appetite, and policies and charters in place. That's phase 1. Phase 2, conduct an enterprise risk assessment in detail by risk category or whatever framework you choose that rolls up to a risk profile and key data by risk category, right? From that, you should be able to move into a measurement system that identifies emerging risk or top risk, prioritize them, further analyze them. If you have residual risk, develop risk mitigation plans. From there, you should have enough information to structure a well-defined dashboard, if you will, consisting of key risk indicators and a report structure that is timely and accurate, and you're getting the right information to the right people. And if these 4 steps work, you should have a decision-making process that allows you to enhance or further control your risk. And I think you'll discover that an effective ERM process really can synchronize both risk management and performance management in a useful way for senior leaders as well as board members. So with that, I do notice I have a question here, and I apologize that I didn't address it when it came up. So how does the ERM risk assessment process feed into risk-based capital plan? What is the correlation? Great question. Here's my interpretation. So again, how does ERM risk assessment process feed into the risk-based capital plan? So first of all, without getting too detailed into a capital plan, your capital plan should have a composite assessment of drawn from your enterprise risk management. So in other words, when you're thinking of capital planning, you need to address things like credit risk, interest rate risk, liquidity risk. And so I'm going to use a visual that we had in here. I think we had in here. Oh, no, it's in this report. And I apologize if I'm departing too far for somebody. But this has to do with capital adequacy, right? So there's a couple of ways of doing this. You could do it through stress testing. But let's just assume this is your bank and you've completed your enterprise risk assessment, right? You've identified your inherent risk, adequacy of risk management, which resulted in a composite score. What you can do with that at that point is drop your composite score and risk weight each category. Obviously, this isn't elaborate here. This is just kind of a mayonnaise effect. But by going through this process of tying in your composite risk score through ERM and risk weighting those categories and assigning a value to it, you can actually determine what the appropriate level of adequate capital is based on your risk profile. So if we're looking at tier 1 risk or tier 1 leverage, PCA well capitalized is 5. Now, if this model had data in it, it would indicate what's the implied minimum based on your risk profile. Maybe it adds 1 or 1.5%, 2% to it. But then you want to ask yourself, well, what's my capital policy? So in this bank's example, it's 8%. That's my internal policy. Actual tier 1 level is 12. So this happens to be a $1.1 billion bank. And if I want to determine what my capital reserves are or my excess capital above policy, it's $52 million. But that's taking qualitative and quantitative measure, creating a buffer, and then illustrating it based on regulatory minimums, implied minimum based on your risk profile, policy level, and actual level. Hope that answers your question. If you'd like more detail on that, I'd be happy to discuss it with you because capital planning and enterprise risk management are literally attached at the hip from a process standpoint. And with that said, I think we're probably butting up against our time. If anybody else has any questions, please feel free to submit them to us. A quick word about us. You know, what we do is we do ensure community bank our clients' business risk priorities are in sync, and we accomplish that by seamlessly integrating enterprise risk management, strategic planning, and capital planning. That's what we do, and we think they're aligned. And if just from a quick pitch, we do have ERM solution suite, if you will, so full implementation. We also break it down into modules. We also have a quarterly reporting dashboard. So with that, if anybody has any other questions you'd like to submit, I hope that gave you a good sense of the 5-step process. And again, if you would like a copy of the presentation, please let us know, and we'll get those off to you. And with that said, I think the clock is striking about 33 minutes into our session. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedule to listen to our approach to an effective ERM solution. If you have any additional questions, please let us know. You all have a great day.